Good evening. I'm Deborah Leff. I'm director of the Kennedy Library. On behalf of myself and John Shattuck, CEO of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, I welcome you to the last in our series of forums on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Tonight, we are fortunate to be able to draw on the rich resource of people who participated in the reporting of the crisis at the time. We focus on how the country learned about the crisis and how the country responded to it. This evening's forum is sponsored by Boston Capital and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors are WBUR, the Boston Globe, and Boston.com. Before I ask our panelists to join me on stage, let's go together to the Kennedy Library's audiovisual archives and remember the Cuban Missile Crisis as reported 40 years ago in the media.
This month, Cuba has displaced Berlin and South Vietnam and all our other problems as America's #1 international crisis.
Kennedy will address the nation tonight on radio and television on a subject of the highest national urgency.
Cuba reacted to the president's speech tonight by ordering all its armed forces on an immediate alert.
Military buildup is continuing here in Florida tonight.
The lights are still burning in the president's living quarters. As President Kennedy understands better tonight than ever before what Thomas Jefferson meant when he called the president's existence this life in splendid misery. The president simply waits tonight, like the rest of us, for whatever tomorrow and the days that flow after will bring.
This is the point at which we are concerned that there might be shooting among the ships at sea, that in the story that we heard a great deal of today, the possibility that invasion might have to be undertaken to assure that those bases are eliminated. If invasion is undertaken, the Russians have said that they would retaliate with rocket fire. We have said if there's rocket fire from Cuba, we will retaliate, and there goes the whole ball game.
Several conflicting and inconsistent proposals have been made by the USSR within the last 24 hours.
Nikita Khrushchev today did precisely what President Kennedy has been asking him to do ever since this crisis began. He ordered the dismantling of Soviet missile bases in Cuba and the return of the rockets to the Soviet Union.
The world seems to have veered off, at least for the moment, the collision course toward global annihilation. After 4 days of touch and go, war or peace crisis, the diplomats of East and West agreed to go back behind closed doors. Their goal, to reconcile or at least to blunt the most direct confrontation ever between the Soviet Union and the United States.
I'd like to ask our panelists to join us on stage.
You all my life. We were roommates.
Yes, well, I'll now be introducing in sort of random order since. But on the right, reporting from Moscow during the Cuban Missile Crisis was Marvin Kal, who had a distinguished 30-year career with CBS and NBC News, during which he won 2 Peabody Awards, the DuPont Award, and more than half a dozen overseas press awards. Marvin now is executive director of the Washington, D.C. office of the Joan Shorenstein Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard University. I have to say it's just a very special honor that joining us in our audience tonight and here for this event is Walter Shorenstein, who founded the Shorenstein Center. Walter. We're so pleased to have you join us. Marvin has the unenviable task of being our moderator tonight, and he has promised to rival his performance on Years at Meet the Press. Beside him, and looking not a day older than he did in that film clip we just saw, is Sander Vanocur, who at the time was the White House correspondent for NBC News. Mr. Vanocur continues his extraordinary career, having worked as a senior correspondent at NBC and ABC and as a reporter for the New York Times and the Washington Post. Beside him is Sid Davis, who was the Westinghouse bureau chief at the time. He actually was in the Oval Office with President Kennedy at the time that he gave his Cuban Missile Crisis address. Sitting beside Sid is Sandra Vanocur's college roommate, better known to some as Newton Minow. Newt is best known, perhaps, for his characterization of television as a vast wasteland, which is why we're pleased that WBUR is here tonight. But during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Newt was given a very special White House assignment, getting the President's Voice of America speech in Spanish broadcast on American commercial radio stations that could reach Cuba, because the Soviets were jamming the Voice of America. We'll hear about that tonight. Beside Newt is yet another White House correspondent, 40 years with CBS, including reporting on the Cuban Missile Crisis, the winner of 2 Emmy Awards, Robert Pierpoint. And rounding out our panel is Tom Smith, Director of the General Social Survey at the University of Chicago's National Opinion Research Center. Mr. Smith is one of the country's leading survey researchers, and he has just completed a study for the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation on the impact of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you can find on our website, and he looks at public opinion at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Marvin, I turn it over to you.
Okay,
Thanks.
Deborah, thank you. Thank you all very much. As you could tell from the introductions, this panel breaks down pretty easily into 3 categories. We've got a scholar, a public opinion scholar at the far end, and Tom is going to talk to us about his new research. A Newton Minow, who represents the government during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then there are 4 of us, overwhelming in number, if perhaps in no other category, but overwhelming in number, 3 guys who actually covered, reporters who actually covered the Cuban Missile Crisis from Washington, indeed from the White House, and me, who was with CBS at the time covering it from Moscow. So what I would like to do is to ask our scholar first to give us the results of his very interesting poll, because it seems, in my judgment, to fly in the face of some of the opinions that I thought were prevalent at the time. Tom.
Thank you. The American people, both at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis and thereafter, have seen the Cuban Missile Crisis as a defining moment, both of the Cold War in general and of Kennedy's presidency in particular. The American people have been asked many times over the last 60 years, what is the most important problem facing the country? At the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, more people mentioned foreign affairs as that problem than at any other time except the month before Pearl Harbor. In terms of Kennedy's presidency, a poll done 20 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis asked people, what was the most important event of Kennedy's presidency? And of course, there were many important events: the Berlin Wall, the Civil Rights Movement, March on Washington, and so on. But the number one thing that people remembered as the most important thing of his presidency was the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the crisis became public, the public immediately backed the president. 90% of Americans stood behind the policy of quarantine that the president adopted. But neither at that time nor at any time during the period 1961 to 1963 did the American people back invading Cuba. Only 20 to 24% of Americans at any point favored invading Cuba. But they favored the course of the quarantine to get the missiles out and back the president. Now, what is perhaps most surprising in looking at the surveys that were done at the time was that the public was highly concerned and highly focused on the events in Cuba, the events going on between Washington and Moscow. But they were not terrified. They were not driven to panic. The National Opinion Research Center happened to be in the middle of a survey in which it was studying stress and psychological well-being. And we fielded an unplanned interview during the week, the peak week of the crisis. And what we found compared to the baseline readings that had been done that spring, the spring of '62, was that measures of stress were not up, that psychological well-being held steady, and the level of fears and worries did not escalate. There was one item, of course, that went up dramatically. There was a question we had asked in the spring of '62 about things you were thinking about in the previous week. One of those things, they included the kind of things you would expect. Job, family, health, things like that. But one was about, had you thought about nuclear war? And that went from 27% to 60-some% of the American people having thought about nuclear war in the previous week when the crisis came on. But quite surprisingly, another of the questions was, had you thought about death in the previous week? And that actually went down. While people concentrated on the immediate political crisis, they did not fall apart during that week.
Oh, thank you very much. The reason I said before that it surprised me was that I was in Moscow at the time, and I remember getting reports from people in the United States that they were stocking up on food, that they were building private air raid shelters in their backyards. Was that not the case? Why would people do that if their psychological well-being was not escalated?
Right. The figures we have is in response to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 4% of Americans took a security measure. They either went for the evacuation, the bomb shelter, the stockpiling. And, of course, those were highly newsworthy things to take and report. But they represent the 4% who went to those more extreme than typical measures for the standard. The standard response was to keep close watch on what you gentlemen were doing.
Okay, I guess I only talked to that 4%. That's part of the problem. I got to deal with the other 96 one of these days. Now, for the four of you, keeping myself out at the moment, try to think of a single, large, illuminating moment that you yourselves experienced that will help the audience understand what it was like in those days, based on your own personal experience. And I want to go to Newton Minow first because he was the only one inside the U.S. government at the time.
Several days before the president spoke to the nation, I had a call at home one evening from the Undersecretary of State, George Ball. It was unusual because he said, "Where are you going to be the next few days?" And he said he wanted a very detailed itinerary, and I was going to New York to meet with the European broadcasters. Frank Stanton, the head of CBS, and I were laying out plans for the use of communication satellites with the European broadcasters. So I gave him all the numbers. 7 a.m. on Monday morning, Pierre Salinger called me and said, quote, "Get your ass down to the White House. There's a national emergency." I gave my speech to Frank. I hope he's here tonight. We invited him, and I'd love to hear his recollection of it. I raced to the airport in the shuttle, and Pierre Salinger and Don Wilson told me that there were missiles in Cuba aimed at the United States. The president wanted to speak to the nation. The Voice of America was jammed by the Russians, and there were some American commercial radio stations that could carry the broadcast. Could I take care of it? Being 36 years old and not afraid of anything at the time, I said, "Sure, yes, we'll do it." Went to the office, called in the senior staff. They said, you're not allowed to do this. It's against the law. You can't, even in wartime, you can't do this. And Pierre had said to me, "You can't tell anybody what you're doing." I called Pierre and I said, "I'm going to have to work with the stations." He said, "I haven't got time." He said, you do it your way, but don't have any leaks. We ordered what they call lines patched from AT&T to the stations without telling the stations. I called each one and said, I want the boss at the station at 6 p.m. because there is going to be a very important announcement. We're going to call you back from the White House. They were all there. I went back to the White House. We called. All of them agreed to cooperate. At 7 p.m., the broadcast went out in Spanish from these stations, and they were all reached in Cuba. In the morning, I was invited to a report, I think it must have been the CIA, I wasn't told, at the executive committee, reported that the signals came in loud and clear and that a very substantial percentage of the Cuban population heard the president's speech in Spanish. The president looked at me and he said, let's do it again tonight. And that went on for the entire duration of the crisis. When it was all over, the stations said, where do we send the bill? And I said, what bill? They said, well, we knocked off all our commercials. We had no revenue for the week. And I said, well, I don't have any money for that. Ed Murrow was head of the USA, and I tried to figure out some way to pay them. We didn't. And finally, I called Pierre, and I said, let the president invite him to lunch. And they all came to the White House, had their picture taken. There was no bill. Everybody was very happy about it. The thing that happened a few months later, one of the stations, it was owned by a church group, came to see me. It was a Catholic priest, and he said, Mr. Minow, you remember what we did for you a few months ago with this? I said, yes. He said, well, one of our stations is in a little trouble with the FCC. Do you think, in view of what we did for you, that maybe you could... I said, whatever it is, it's taken care of, Father. And I called the staff, and I said, tear it up, whatever in the world it is. Today, I'd go to jail for that.
Newt, thank you. Thank you very much. Now to our three journalists, and I'm going to do it in alphabetical order. Sid Davis, you start us off, please.
Well, as Debbie pointed out, I was in the Oval Office when the president delivered the speech announcing the quarantine of Cuba. But I want to step back a couple of days before that because the president learned on Monday, the 15th of October, from U-2 photographs that there were missile launchers and some heavy missiles in Cuba. And yet on Friday of that week, he still went to Ohio and Chicago on a political trip, probably reluctantly, knowing that. And on Saturday morning in Chicago, they decided that they would fly back to Washington. And they called Salinger into the suite at the Sheraton Blackstone Hotel, and they deliberately posted the Admiral Berkeley in the room. Admiral Berkeley was the president's physician, so that it would make Salinger at least feel that there was a medical opinion here. Kenny O'Donnell told Salinger, the president has a cold, and we're going back to Washington, go tell the rest of the press corps. And according to Salinger's book, as Salinger went to the door, the president walked over to him and handed him a note, which said, I have a 99.2 temperature, and it's an upper respiratory ailment. And they flew back to Washington in order to reinforce the idea that the president was sick. He'd get off the plane wearing a fedora, and everybody who knew John Kennedy knew that he hated hats. He never wanted to wear a hat. And we soon discovered, of course, that the cold was a diplomatic cold, and there was a fib to keep everybody guessing on what was happening. My guess is if that had happened today, the headlines and all the tabloids would be, Kennedy lied about his cold. In any event, during that speech, when he came into the room, he had no teleprompter. The cameras were still the old, big, large network television cameras. He had to step around them. And he had a sheaf of papers because he had no speech on a prompter, so he was going to read from paper. And I did notice the papers were trembling in his hands, which worried me a little bit. I was fairly new to the White House, maybe a year or so into covering the White House. But once he started to talk, it seemed to me that ice water rolled through his veins. He was very deliberate, determined to let Khrushchev know that he was going to get the missiles out of Cuba. And the interesting thing was that I noticed he did have a stuffy nose, and most people who were in the room determined that he did sound like he had a cold, so it worked out okay. There are a lot more anecdotal stories we can tell, It was a very important week, and one of the things I would like to point out about that week was the precision in which the White House press office handled the information to the press and the nature of the press corps at that time. Most of the correspondents at the White House were older than I was, older than Sandy, older than Bob. For the women in the room, I'll point out the obvious. There weren't many women correspondents at the White House in those days. But we did have very professional people covering the White House, and Salinger pretty much stuck to the script. There was no paraphrasing of anything. They wanted the Soviets to understand perfectly what the United States message was, and they didn't want to wander off of it.
Thank you very much, Sid. Bob Pierpoint.
First of all, I'm one of the 4% that was really terrified. I had been covering the White House under Eisenhower, started under Eisenhower, and I had gone on to cover under Kennedy, and I didn't really know Kennedy that well, and the Bay of Pigs invasion took place, and I garnered much information about the president from his handling of that. But when the president made that speech on Monday night of the 22nd, I noticed, as Sid suggested, that he seemed to be nervous, and I didn't really think it was a cold. I thought he was nervous, and as I listened to him, I became more and more nervous myself. As a matter of fact, and we had cameras in the White House at that time. Supposedly we were to comment, but there wasn't a great deal to really say. The president said it all. He laid out the information to us, which I must say today we aren't getting on Iraq in the same detail, and I wish we were, because I think at that time it helped the country to come together. I happened to live on a street with a gentleman who was involved with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Organization. He had built a cellar. He was stocking it. The rumor went around the neighborhood that if anybody else tried to get into his cellar, if the bomb went off, he would use a gun to keep us out. That didn't help my feelings at all. As the week went on, and we began to understand the seriousness of this crisis, I said to my wife, and this brings back memories that are difficult, but I felt that the danger to my family and my 4 children was such that I wanted to do whatever I could to save them. There really wasn't much we could do. What I did was I took the boys out and I bought a gun. I showed them how to use it. And on the Wednesday that Kennedy had ordered the Navy to stop those ships coming into the Cuban harbor, I said to my wife that morning, 3 o'clock this afternoon, if you haven't heard from me, you put the kids in the car and provisions, and you head for the mountains. I had been taken by the Eisenhower people to one of those hideouts where they were going to set up government several years before, and I knew generally where it was. We'd been taken by helicopter, and I knew it was in the mountains of either Virginia or West Virginia, and I knew, generally speaking, where my wife was going to be. We had agreed on a spot. And I said, if you can get there, I'll find you somehow. Well, at 12:30 that Wednesday, the Wednesday that I had said to my wife, you better get the kids and go, we were told at the White House, and actually they showed the pictures on television for us, that the Soviet ships had stopped dead in the water. I picked up the phone as soon as I had finished my broadcast and called my wife and said, don't leave, we're okay. I thought that was the basic end of the crisis, and I was wrong. As a matter of fact, After the crisis had passed, I had a private conversation with McGeorge Bundy, the president's head of his National Security Council, and Bundy explained to me, no, that wasn't the most dangerous time. The most dangerous time was that following Saturday when the Cubans or the Soviets, and I'm not sure which it was, shot down our U-2 plane that was flying over the area. He said at that point, the military put heavy pressure on the president to go ahead and strike. And I'm not going to go into the history of it because I know most of you have already heard all of this. But as you know, the president and Bobby Kennedy decided on a different course and did not strike despite the urging of the military. And as a matter of fact, they finally figured out a way to get us out of that particular crisis. And I would like to point out one interesting parallel to what's happening today, or maybe it's not a parallel. Today, it seems to be the politicians who want to get us into war, and many of our military leaders are opposed to the war in Iraq. In those days, it was just the opposite. The military urged Kennedy to strike. His main goal was to get the missiles out of Cuba without war.
Thanks, Bob. Sandy Vanocur, please.
The first inkling I had that something was up was on Saturday night. I knew the president was coming back. I did a Saturday night news show on NBC in those days, and I came home. And I noticed to my right, at the home of a man named Jim Rowe, a lot of cars that looked like White House cars were unloading people. Jim Rowe was a student of Felix Frankfurter, along with others. They came to Washington. They were called the Happy Hot Dogs. He was Justice Holmes' last law clerk and a big Johnson supporter in the 1960 campaign. After dinner, I went outside and I noticed a lot of those cars were taking people away. I didn't see who they were, but they looked like White House cars. I spent Sunday trying to find out what was going on. I drew a blank. The president's speech was made Monday. Tuesday morning, Pierre Salinger calls me into his office, and he said to me, "You're to let the White House know where you are 24 hours a day." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because in case of an evacuation of the president and his family, no doubt to those places Bob referred, you're to go with them as the radio TV pool correspondent." Well, I had my late wife, I had a boy 5, a boy 3. I didn't know what I was going to do. I went home. She obviously could see in my face something was awry. She said, "Is there going to be a war?" I said, "Could you please get me a large drink?" She brought the drink. I looked at it. The doorbell downstairs rang. I went down. There was a Western Union wire. I pulled it out of the slot, took it upstairs, put it down. She said, "For God's sakes, open it." I opened it, read it, and I smiled and said, "There's not going to be a war." She said, "Is that in the telegram?" I said, "Well, almost." I said, "That's an invitation from Eunice and Sarge Shriver for dinner for the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire on Saturday night, and Eunice Shriver would never allow World War III to interfere with the social plan."
You want to tell us another story? My stories concern that of a Moscow correspondent for CBS. Because of the time difference, we didn't hear the president's speech until early Tuesday morning. It was, of course, a shock, but not that much of a shock, because if you had read the Soviet press carefully, starting in about August, there had been built up a tremendous anger. It was artificially trumped up, but it seemed to me, measured against the seriousness of other crises that we were having at that time, focusing on Berlin, that this Cuba crisis was something important because the Russians were, in effect, taking space away from the Berlin crisis. So I began to spend a lot of time reading this carefully and doing a lot of broadcasts for CBS saying that the Russians are getting all worked up about Cuba. They were getting worked up about Cuba and arguing that the United States was going to invade Cuba and overthrow a communist regime. They were saying this flat out and openly starting in late August. On Wednesday of that week, my wife and I went to the Bolshoi, and there was, I believe, George London, an American opera star at the time, and he was singing, and lo and behold, the entire Soviet Politburo arrives. The entire Politburo arrives. That in and of itself was a very important signal, because we're Wednesday, you're getting nervous, we're all getting nervous, and here is the leader of the Soviet Union arriving. Well, when it was over, a number of reporters there went with Khrushchev backstage when he told George London that it was very important for the United States and the Soviet Union to get along. And that was a big-time story, and it was an important signal, and we went ahead and broadcast that. On that same Wednesday, when I was doing a broadcast, the vice president of CBS News was Blair Clark, no longer with us, a wonderful reporter himself. He was a roommate of John Kennedy when they were both at Harvard. And the deal that we had, sort of an understanding between the two of us, that when Blair spoke of his roommate, I was to understand he was tipping me off that he had something direct from the president himself. And what Blair said to me on that Wednesday was that following a talk with his roommate, he thought it would be a good idea for Mady to leave Moscow and to go to Copenhagen. And I said at that time that it was my judgment that there was no reason for her to leave Moscow, and she ought to be there because this is a terrific story, but it isn't what you guys are thinking. On that Sunday, I was in doing a broadcast, the normal World News Roundup broadcast, when a Russian came in, a Russian reporter, and said that a Russian named Levitan, I believe, was going to do an important broadcast at 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, which was 8 a.m. in Washington. And I allowed the broadcast to run straight on through so that in New York they were picking it up. And I was interpreting it, and I said that they have just blinked. The other guys just blinked. And David Schoenbrunn, whom you saw on this clip, it was from that program that Schoenbrunn then shortly thereafter turned to me and said, "What does this mean?" And I said, it seemed to me that the Russians have just blinked and the crisis is over. During the next commercial break, Schoenbrunn got a call from Salinger, who was called by the president to say, "Tell that guy in Moscow to shut up about people blinking, because we don't want the Russians to have the feeling that somehow their ego was involved, that they had caved to the United States. We want it all to be just fine," sort of pat them all on the back. The reason that I was comfortable with the idea, Tom, going against the thrust of your argument, in a sense, the reason that I was comfortable that there would not be a war was this story. The Russians have an expression, "Khlyeby-solstva," which means hospitality. It comes from the Russian word khlyeb, which is bread, and sol, which is salt. And if you went to a Russian marketplace that week, unlike the Berlin crises of the year before and earlier that year, when there was no bread, flour meaning, and no salt to be purchased because the Russians had already bought all of that. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, you could go and buy as much flour and salt as you would want. In other words, the Russian people did not feel that they were on the edge of a major military conflict. And how would they know that? Because they couldn't believe a thing that was written in the press. So they had to believe it by what their sons in the military told them, their fathers, their in-laws. That was the best source of information. And the Russian military at that level was not talking war. So that's the way it looked from sort of a Moscow perspective.
You should have called Bob Pierpoint to say there's plenty of bread and salt here. Don't worry.
Don't worry about it. I could have done that, but I
wish you had.
I didn't realize he was that nervous about it.
Better tell them they're fishes and loaves.
I would like to extend remarks that Marvin made on Berlin, because on that Sunday, when the networks were told that the president was going to make a speech on Monday night and wanted all in network time, boy, our bosses got after us very strongly to find out what was going on. And we were all the reporters were under enormous pressure to find out. Well, I got a call during that period from a guy who was in intelligence, whom I had known for many years. And he said, "You're concerned about this?" And I said, "Yeah, I sure am." I said, "What can you tell me?" And he said, "Well, you've got to keep your eye on the hole in the donut." That's the way intelligence people talk, I guess. But I said, "What does that mean? Is it Cuba or is it Berlin?" He would not go another inch further, and I came away with the misinterpretation that it was probably Berlin rather than Cuba. So, in a sense, I was in your camp there.
I want to ask the reporters here a question. We're talking about a very serious event that happened 40 years ago. You all were covering the White House at that time. Try to put yourself in the White House today and compare what happened now with what happened then in your lifetimes. What would it have been like?
We then had an evening news cycle, a morning news cycle, and that applied to print, radio, television. We now have a 24-hour-a-day news cycle. We have an electronic tapeworm that has to be fed all the time. If you say no comment, they will say you're hiding something. I think in the almost three years I covered the White House, I did 5 live television spots. That one the night the president's speech from the White House.
Everything had been done in advance and taped.
No.
No?
We look, in '62 we had a 15-minute broadcast until first Cronkite went with a half an hour, then Huntley Brinkley. There wasn't time to put us on a 12-minute news show. So we did mostly radio.
Radio was really more important in those days.
Yeah. And that was our outlet. But today, if today's conditions applied then, you had all these people on the talk shows who cannot say,
"I don't know."
Forbidden. You can't say, "I don't know." Because if you say, "I don't know," why are you there? Lloyd Cutler, who was the counsel to Jimmy Carter and then to Bill Clinton, said that after his service with Carter, he left the White House thinking the chief job of the chief counsel is to prepare the White House for the evening news. Those conditions did not obtain when we were covering the White House.
Newton Minow, when you did a piece not too long ago for USA Today, you made a statement, I think, which was something like, today we wouldn't have 13 days, you wouldn't even have 13 hours, you might not even have 13 minutes. So expand on that.
I think the pressure today, the competitive pressure to be first, is almost insurmountable. When Pierre Salinger called me, and what he was worried about were leaks, if he didn't want me to call the stations, I trusted the stations not to leak anything, and I was right, because at that time, at least in 1962, there were no leaks, and the word did not get out until the president spoke. I don't think that's true today. I think the 40 years have seen a deterioration. I think part of it is because of Watergate, part of it is because of Vietnam. I think people tended in 62 to trust people in public life more than they do today, and I think they tended more to give them the benefit of the doubt. If they said, don't report this today, I don't think that would happen now.
Tom, you were talking about public opinion 40 years ago. Compare it then with now, assuming that there were a crisis of this dimension, and perhaps Iraq will be.
Well, the comments that were just made is entirely true. If we look at all the post-World War II presidents, both in terms of his contemporary ratings and in terms of retrospective ratings, Kennedy is the most approved of president. And that approval has eroded over time. There is less confidence in the leaders of the country, less willing to take in default to the idea that the leader knows what is right and what is best. So
you said before that Kennedy got a 90% approval rating, right?
Well, in terms of his Cuban policy.
Of the Cuban policy, that's what we're talking about. So President Bush got something awfully close to that after 9/11, did he not?
Right, and in 9/11 and the Cuban Missile Crisis are in many ways in completely different events, but they have some similarities in terms of a sudden, immediate threat to the country. And the public rallies around its leaders in terms of crisis. But if you look at President Bush's popularity, it's down 25 percentage points from what it was after 9/11. It doesn't, crisis pushes up the support. But without the crisis, there's much more skepticism in the leadership.
Let me argue that there really is a huge difference between the two. 9/11 came as a total surprise even to the President of the United States, who was down in Florida talking to a group of students. President Kennedy knew about this for at least a month before. He knew. He had got pictures from the CIA as to exactly what was, not exactly, but roughly what was going on. So, Sid Davis, how would you make the comparison between then and now, between these two?
I go back to what Sandy talked about, the media, because the media played a very big role then in what went on. Newton Minow takes over 6 radio stations in the country and puts the Voice of America on it. Moscow was listening. There were only 2 international broadcasters at the time, VOA and BBC, that were respected. And Moscow was listening. The Foreign Ministry was listening to the Voice of America because there was no hotline. The diplomatic pouch was too slow. And so you used respected media and respected correspondents to tell the story. I think, as Sandy pointed out with today's media, the 24-hour news cycle, I think the diplomatic effort would be complicated by today's media. The Russians, Soviets, would probably misunderstand seeing retired U.S. generals on television saying we can invade, we can't invade, or a former CIA director being interviewed on CNN. I think the whole thing would have an entirely different mix today if you had this kind of media back then. It's a miracle that we haven't had some confrontation because of this.
Sandy, when you spoke before about Salinger calling you in on Tuesday morning, when he called you in, were there ground rules set up at the time? Did you understand that it was going to be an off-the-record conversation?
No.
How could you do a broadcast after that was absolutely legit, since you already knew on Tuesday of the week that we were in deep doo-doo?
Well, I don't know.
We knew it Monday night.
President once said.
Yeah, we knew it Monday night, but I don't know about Bob. I can't remember doing much that week because I had nothing to say. I might have done some pro forma, but I was probably standing right next to Bob on that Wednesday when he was going to call his wife, and I looked up, the ships met, and then I thought maybe there'd be a way out of this. I was as scared as Bob was. Anybody who was not scared that week who was covering the White House was a drunk or a fool or both.
What about 96% of the American people?
I don't know what they were. We didn't think about that. All we knew is what we did.
No, but how do you explain?
I don't explain. I don't know.
Let me put one thing here aside and clarify it. it begins to sound a little as if we were cooperating with the White House.
With, I would have put it.
And I was recently on a television broadcast in which I was accused of holding back information at the time from the public, and that the White House had told me things that I didn't report. And I said that is absolutely wrong. I didn't know anything, as Sandy says. We didn't know what was going on. We were terrified that there was going to be a nuclear war. And the only reporter that I know of who got an inkling of what was really happening was Scotty Reston of the New York Times, and he was persuaded by the president not to report what he knew. But those of us who cover the White House were totally in the dark almost the entire time.
How do you account for the fact that you were totally in the dark?
Nobody would answer your phone call.
Yeah, nobody would talk to you.
But wouldn't that tell you?
Well, we knew there was a crisis.
You don't say, Mr. Watson, come here. You don't. What are you going to do after you got no information? So you tell the people back in the office, I got nothing to say.
What about people up on Capitol Hill, some of whom were briefed?
You had Senator Keating of New York.
Now, this is the most important name that's come up. Go ahead.
Well, Senator Keating, a Republican senator from New York, for weeks before the Cuban Missile Crisis, kept talking about Soviet missiles in Cuba.
Yeah.
And he couldn't get very much mileage with it, but he kept making speeches on the Senate floor. Later on, in argument against Keating, I guess, they were saying what Keating was talking about was...
Those were SAM missiles.
The tactical defensive weapons, and not...
They were not nuclear missiles.
August 31st, 1962, he's talking about SAM. And you see, with Ken Keating, we knew he was making these charges. Indeed, Kenny O'Donnell told me that the reason why Kennedy went forward with the Bay of Pigs was because they were afraid that Ken Keating would leak the story that he was turning his back on this plan to topple Castro. Well, we didn't know where Ken Keating was getting his information. His papers are at Rochester. There's an article written by a man, his name is Marshall, I believe, that suggests he was getting it from Claire Booth Luce, who was on the Intelligence Advisory Board. It suggested he was getting his information from the CIA. It suggested that he got his information from Cuban exiles. But it was something that Kennedy was worried about, and we in the press, we reported it, but that's as far as we got with it.
They kept knocking the story down.
So they were lying to you.
Well, but...
No.
They were lying to you, weren't they?
No. We don't know what Keating had, see?
Well, he said that there were missiles.
But in this rundown that the National Security group has put together, even Kennedy was suspicious about the pictures.
The story we got was that they were defensive missiles. They weren't offensive missiles that Keating was talking about, and they said we knew that. We've known about those for a long time.
But you've got to remember, Marvin, you're looking at this from the White House perspective. There were a lot of other things going on. The White House sent the ambassador to the United Nations to speak to the world and to take pictures with him of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it wasn't just the White House. There was news that was happening in other fronts that was telling the story.
Plus, there's a book out there in the hallway, One Hell of a Gamble, by Tim Naftali, who is at the Miller Center at Charlottesville, and a Russian. And Tim says the Russians have been much more forthcoming about releasing their records. When in there, we didn't know what John Scali was doing. Tell him what John Scali was doing.
Scali was a reporter for ABC at the time. He had been with the Associated Press, and he was a State Department correspondent and probably one of the best diplomatic correspondents that ever came to Washington. He really worked his beat, and he was highly regarded. And one of the members of the Soviet embassy, Alexander Fomin was his name, contacted Scali. They had lunch at the Occidental restaurant. And this was at the height of the crisis. Now, Kennedy has made a speech about the quarantine. And he upset Khrushchev when Kennedy said that the United States would consider an attack on the United States an attack by the Soviet Union, not Havana. And apparently that sent Khrushchev went ballistic over that. He did not expect Kennedy to say that. So the Russians are uptight. They send this guy to meet Scali at the restaurant, and the guy, apparently from what I've read and know, said, look, if Khrushchev promises to take the missiles out of Cuba, will Kennedy promise not to invade? And Scally said, I'll take it to the State Department. And according to legend, about 2 hours later, Khrushchev announced that the missiles were going to come out of Cuba. There are several other reporters who were in this mix who...
Well, then there was Warren Rogers, who goes to the press club. The bartender is a former Ukrainian citizen, now an American. Warren says, the Herald Tribune says to somebody else, that he's going south, meaning invasion. They leave. A guy, was it from TASS or...
It was TASS.
TASS comes in, talks to the former Ukrainian. The Ukrainian tells him the story. The next day, that information is on Khrushchev's desk. We didn't know squat.
Weren't we actually being used as conduits when Salinger would come out and we were doing live broadcasts and the Soviets were monitoring?
Absolutely.
Wasn't that one of the ways that we communicated, that is, the White House communicated with the Soviet Union?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It was picked up by the Russians almost immediately, and Sandy's going to say, what's new about that? And nothing. The answer is nothing is new about that. It's done all the time. But what I'm interested in is talking a little bit more, and Newt, perhaps you could help us. What was the White House view of the press as it was focusing on this crisis? Did it see the press as a hostile force that had to be contended with, a nuisance, an ally? How would you put it?
I would not put it that way. I think that is certainly true today, and it's been true in recent years, but at that time, I think the White House saw the press, certainly JFK saw the press, as that's the way he got elected. JFK once said to me, he said, I wouldn't have been elected without television, and he did not see the press as an enemy.
Okay, so I asked, as an ally?
Not necessarily an ally, but not an enemy either.
Conduit?
A conduit, right.
Yeah, but
he enjoyed the press conference as a way to get...
There's also this phrase that Wordsworth used about willing suspension of disbelief. Where we, I think, were off the mark is we didn't pay enough attention to Kennedy and the campaign talking about Cuba. A speech here he makes October 6th in Cincinnati. Christ, we've been on the road for 3 weeks with Nixon and Kennedy. We're drinking Bloody Marys at 6:30 in the morning. He's making a speech on Cuba in Cincinnati. And he says the American people want to know how this permitted to happen, how the Iron Curtain should advance almost to our front yard. They want to know the truth, and I believe they're entitled to the truth. It is not enough to blame it on an unknown State Department personnel. And then he goes on. In the second debate, Kennedy goes after Nixon. Who lost Cuba? This is all a reaction to the Republican charge, who lost China? And later on, Chip Bolin, who was then at home, and in his memoirs, he criticizes Kennedy for being irresponsible about Cuba. Now, I'm trying to think, did we report this? Did we report this, Bob? I can't remember if we did.
I don't think so, but I want to go back to finish my answer about the press. JFK liked journalists. He found them stimulating, interesting people to be with. That hasn't been true for a long time with our incumbent president.
Several presidents since then, it's not been true also. Lyndon Johnson in particular. I want to make a point that I think backs up to some extent what Professor Smith here says, and that is that we're not nearly as important as we think we are. That 4% was mostly around Washington, I think, that was really terrorized. My family, and that is my ancestral family, and my friends, many of them are in California, where I now have retired to, and they are still in somewhat disbelief that this crisis was, in fact, a nuclear crisis. At the time, when I went out after the crisis was over to visit relatives in California, they weren't concerned. They didn't think it was a big deal. I think the further away you got from Washington, the less worried you were.
What does that say about the American people or the press?
Or us, yeah.
I mean, the American people indifferent to what's going on now with Iraq.
Well, I think today you have much more involvement because of all of this instant cable and instant news, and I think people are somewhat better educated in a sense on foreign policy. They're more involved. But in those days in California, I was astounded to find that people weren't really worried, and when I would tell them that we were scared to death and that I had to send my family to the mountains or prepare them to go, they said, why? And I began to realize that they didn't really listen to me. They didn't listen to Sid and Sandy, or
Sandy, hang on just one second. We're at that point, or almost at that point, where we would like to invite you to join our discussion, and there are 2 microphones set up right here. And those of you who would like to ask a question, please do come up to the microphone. I will recognize you, identify yourselves, ask a question. Please don't make a speech, or I'll cut you off. And start. Sandy, go ahead.
Remember the high regard the CIA was held in this time. We didn't have church hearings yet. We knew nothing about something called Operation Mongoose, devised in the Eisenhower administration, accepted by the Kennedy administration, run by a man named Edwin Lansdale, a book written about him called The Ugly American, then a man named William Harvey. I was in the 7880 MID in Berlin from 52 to 54. William Harvey was there, the new chief of the CIA operation, huge guy, sweaty, carried a gun. We didn't know about it. Did anybody know about Operation Mongoose? You see, now we're talking about things that have come out. We didn't know it, and the CIA did have some good friends in the press. And if they knew them, they weren't going to report them. It was a different world then. The most important thing is you seem to trust your government then.
Are we better off today with an attitude of skepticism to distrust, that range of attitude, than we were 40 years ago when there was this perhaps healthy to unhealthy degree of faith in government? What would be your sense? Well, Tom, why don't you start us on that? Are we better off today than we were then?
I think we're better off for the following reason. If the American people were completely disillusioned, cynical, and had no legitimacy in the government, then we would be worse off. But the people will rally around the government in times of crisis and in time of need. We're not like the Russians in 1917 when the country collapses and the people give up on the Tsar and the government. But day-to-day skepticism on everything you hear from Washington, I think, is a good thing, as long as there's still an underlying legitimacy that still exists in which people will take and back the leadership when that is needed. And I think that's the situation we have today.
Okay. Newt, did you want to come in?
There's a journalist in Washington who has a big sign on his wall that says, "Don't confuse skepticism with cynicism." I think that because of what's happened in the last 40 years, particularly 2 things, Watergate and Vietnam, I think those 2 things shattered the trust that most of us have felt in government, and I think too many people have confused skepticism and cynicism.
Okay.
I think I agree totally. I think we are better off. I agree with Tom on that. But Watergate and Vietnam, I don't think that they made reporters skeptics. I think we, as any professional reporter, have always been skeptics. That's what we should be. But I think that the public in general became disillusioned, should I say, with after Watergate and Vietnam. And maybe in a way that's a good thing, because we were founded on the principle that we don't particularly like government. We didn't like royalty, and we don't particularly like government, and I think that's probably not bad.
We came into our maturity not as avenging angels sent down to do the Lord and John Peter Zenger's work here on earth. I subscribe to the great line of the late Eddie Leahy of the late Chicago Daily News. Every good general assignment reporter should have the depth of a 1-pound box of candy. We didn't see ourselves as guardians at the gate, and it was a baffling week. That's all I can. And we'll proceed. It was baffling too.
There's a gentleman.
Well, may I just say something about that period? Just about the missile crisis in that period. There were damn fine reporters covering the White House in Washington, and we were probing and tough. We just, at that point, the whole government was in unison in not giving us information. Even Pierre Salinger didn't know when we flew back to Washington with the president, with his cold, that there was a missile crisis. He was out of the loop. And I agree with Newt on the acrimony that has come since. But we did have tough reporting then, good reporting at those days.
Okay, I'd like to challenge that, but let's get the gentleman involved here.
First of all, I'd like to tell you I was one of the 4% also, and I come from rural Maine, Rumford, Maine, and I was in 8th grade, and we were very scared, and my parents did have food in the cellar, and water, and I was a person who watched you gentlemen on television that week and watched Ambassador Stevenson as well. My question is this. How should the public evaluate the press coverage today in light of your admission that you really knew very little about what was going on? Someone just said that skepticism seems to be a view, or, is what you have. But skepticism about policy today is viewed as very unpatriotic.
Well, don't you think it's always been viewed that way by certain elements in our society? I think through the history of the country, if you question someone in power, you take a risk.
And I think the idea of skepticism is probably a healthy thing. Cynicism probably tilts in the direction of something that is unhealthy in a reporter, because then you have a feeling that everything you're told, almost everything, is probably untrue. And that doesn't help you as a reporter at all. But skepticism in the sense of holding up, as my brother has often said, holding up to sunlight the statements of the government and checking them out for truth is the job of a good reporter. It is the job, really, of a good reporter to try to take government statements and find out if there's truth behind it. Right now we are being told, I think, a great deal about Iraq. I don't agree with Bob on this. I don't think that the government is holding back a great deal. I think they're telling us a lot. It's whether the American people are prepared to accept what it is that the government is laying out. That's a different issue. And it may be 4% or it may be 34%. I don't know. But there's, up in Cambridge, in the day that I've been here now on this visit, I think there's a 99% disbelief that there is a need for a war with Iraq. But I think if you go out and travel around the country, I did a little bit of it in recent weeks, there's a more or less willingness of the public to go along with the president, to give him the benefit of the doubt. There's doubt, but to give him the benefit of the doubt. Yes, sir, go ahead.
Good evening. I have a question, I believe, for Mr. Davis. You were involved with the Spanish communication to Cuba, is that correct? Or was that Mr. Minow? I'm sorry, Mr. Minow. Were there any concerns in the White House about the translation of the word quarantine versus blockade in terms of that message being sent to the Cuban people? In terms of versus, I know in terms of blockade is the term a declaration of war, but was there any concern over that translation?
The translation was done by the Voice of America, who are experts at this and provide Spanish language broadcasts every day. So I think they were very professional, and I don't think anybody questioned the accuracy of the translations.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
If any one of the newsmen did get the scoop of a lifetime and you had some inside information, a leak, would you, like Scotty Reston, have sat on it, or would you have gone forward with it?
Good question.
Thank you. Start with Sandy.
Yes, And the New York Times did this at the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy later said if the New York Times had gone forward with the story on the Bay of Pigs, he would not have committed what he later said was a great act of stupidity.
Meaning what? That you hold back on a story that may be a great act of stupidity?
No,
the
Bay of Pigs.
No, I understand what you were saying about the Bay of Pigs, but in terms of the Cuban missiles,
I'd have done what Scotty Reston did.
You'd have held back.
Sure.
What would have been your reasoning?
There was something more important at stake than me getting a scoop. Listen, let me tell you about scoops. I break the Kennedy-Khrushchev summit meeting. I find out about it from a tip from Ted Clifton, the president's military aide, while playing golf down in Palm Beach. He says, take more clothes than just a trip to Paris to see de Gaulle. I think about it. The next morning in the paper, there's a little item. Khrushchev makes a very conciliatory speech about Kennedy. I call Salinger's office, leave word I want to talk to him, and mention what I'm interested in. He calls back and said, if you think you're going anywhere with that story, you better call me first. Sunday, I called 2 people at the White House, one in foreign policy, one in domestic. The domestic guy says, after I explore my theory, you're a very good reporter. I break the story. Tim Naftali told me out at a conference at UCSB that plans for the summit meeting had been made before the Bay of Pigs. So all my great reasoning, what the hell did it mean?
Sid?
I would have done what Reston did. As a matter of fact, Reston talked, according to a piece by Max Frankel in Smithsonian Magazine, the president talked personally with Reston. And Reston had reservations. It wasn't a case where Reston said, okay, Mr. President. He said, I'll call you back. And he had a meeting with his staff. And the staff went over it, and Reston decided to call the president back and say they would withhold the story, but the president assured him there would be no, what he called, bloodshed before the speech.
What was the story that Reston had?
The story that Reston, remember, the New York Times never said they had the whole story. It was a story that we knew there were Soviet missiles in Cuba and that Kennedy was going to do something.
So they had that part of the story before the president spoke.
That's right. And Murray Martyr at the Washington Post was onto it. And Murray Martyr was snooping around the State Department. And apparently the White House called Phil Graham, then the publisher of the Washington Post, and said, get Murray Martyr off this story. And the Washington Post backed Murray Martyr off the story. So there were 2 very tenacious newspapers that were onto the thing, and both were asked by the White House not to use it. And I think they made the right call.
And the call was not to use it in the sense of not to break the story before the president has had an opportunity.
Wait till the president makes it. That was what Kennedy asked. Wait till I make my speech, and then you can use the story.
Pierpoint?
I'm not quite sure what I would have done. First of all, I think there's a little bit of a misconception here. Those of us who work in broadcasting or worked in broadcasting do not make those kind of decisions on our own. The fact of the matter is that would have been kicked up to a much higher authority, probably to Blair Clark, who would have called the president. I couldn't have broken the story on my own, even if I had had it. I'm not sure that Scotty and the Washington Post made the right decision. I don't know to this day what difference it would have made whether the New York Times broke the story or whether the president broke the story.
It's interesting that during the 9/11 crisis, which I think is still with us, but during the height of it, as it happened, there was a great deal of cooperation, in fact, between journalists and the government. There was a story that I was told by the spokesperson for Mayor Giuliani, who said that the New York Times wanted very much, obvious, to get their paper out on 9/12. But all of the bridges around Manhattan were blocked by the military and the police. So they couldn't get their papers out of Manhattan or into Manhattan. And the publisher of the New York Times called the governor, Pataki, and asked if he would allow New York Times trucks to pass the barricades that had been set up. And he said, sure. And they allowed there was that degree of cooperation, even, as a matter of fact, what the spokesperson said to me, her name is Sunny, by the way, she has a very sunny disposition, it's amazing. And she said that there was never a request that she made of the media at 9/11 and immediately thereafter that was not honored by the media. So the idea of an irresponsible press today is simply not true. When there is a major story, the press really does play ball. But again, it has to be a major story, as there was with the sniper.
Marvin, let me just set the record straight on one thing. There was a reporter, Warren Rogers, I think with the Herald Tribune, who claims that he had the story on Sunday before Kennedy spoke, before the 22nd, and he was out of the loop. The White House didn't know he had the story, and he used the story and appeared in the Herald Tribune the morning of President Kennedy's speech.
That the president would announce?
That there were missiles in Cuba and the president announced action against them. I don't think he had the quarantine, but he said there was a speech and the president would announce it, and there were missiles in Cuba. And he picked it up independently when he saw the lights burning in the State Department up in the Latin American division and did some sniffing around and got the story.
Right. Yes, sir, please.
I was an Air Force officer sitting underground in a missile site during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And while we recognized the seriousness of the situation, it wasn't until some years later I realized how terrifying it really was. My question is, I haven't heard you gentlemen talk about the missiles in Turkey, and I wondered at what point the press found out about that and reported on it.
Well,
in regards to resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
When you're talking about when the Kennedy administration agreed to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey.
Yes,
I don't think we found out about it until several months later.
What I found out later from Kenny O'Donnell, who is not as distant as people might imagine from some of these things, that Kennedy thought he had ordered the missiles out of Cuba before, and
that's right.
They had not acted upon it. Turkey, and there was some in Italy too, but he thought that he had ordered them out of Turkey.
That's right. There was a political fall. They were afraid of the political fallout from the conservatives, the Republicans, that if he took the missiles out of Turkey, that politically all hell would break loose. So they promised Khrushchev privately that they would take the missiles out of Turkey at a later date.
And I'll tell you that if I had known that, I would have broadcast it, even if Kennedy had not wanted it broadcast, because that was a political decision.
When you read the record, when the 13 days debate started with the executive committee, Adlai Stevenson proposed this very early on. And that idea was rejected as being too weak. But the idea was on the table from the beginning.
Right, from the start, yeah.
Actually, explaining it just for a second, the missiles in Turkey were Jupiter missiles. They were liquid-fueled, and they were old, and they were leaking and seeping. They weren't any damn good anyway, because we by then had the Polaris submarine, and they were really not an issue. But Kennedy was afraid if he took them out, he'd catch hell from the Republicans. Now, Warren Rogers, the man I quoted earlier, who does a lot of investigative reporting still, claims that those Jupiter missiles are still in Turkey.
Yes, sir, please.
My question is for Mr. Minow, and perhaps Mr. Smith has some statistical information to respond as well. As the broadcasts were being made to the people of Cuba for those several days, what kind of feedback, response, or sense were you getting back as to the attitudes of the people and the responses of the people in Cuba?
A good question. I wish I knew the answer. All I knew was that they were hearing it, and that came from the CIA. Whether the CIA reported to the ExCom about what the opinion or reaction of the listeners was, I don't know. I wish I did.
Did Murrow have some comment on that?
I think Ed Murrow did have some comment on it.
He thought it was effective.
It was effective. Yeah.
The only thing I've seen is, of course, the Castro's official reaction to this, which he took a harder line at the time than the Russians did, and objected to the withdrawal of the missiles when it was announced, in part because he wasn't consulted about this, and in part because he saw this short of what he really wanted, which was a public security pact with the Russians. He saw this as protecting Cuba. But I've not seen any evidence about what the Cuban population thought at the time.
Even 40 years later.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you.
What's interesting, 40 years later, there's a cottage industry on the Cuban Missile Crisis, which exists, as you all know, and this is the fifth panel discussion about it because it's the 40th anniversary and there have been discussions down in Washington and all. There's one room empty in that cottage still, if somebody wants to do the reporting on it, and that is what was going on in Russia. The little bit that I saw indicates that it was different. Khrushchev did not have in mind a war with the United States. He had in mind, I think, still, Berlin. Berlin was, as he put it, the bone in his throat. It wasn't, Russians didn't care about Cuba. Cuba was far away and involved people they didn't give a damn about. Berlin, they cared about because there were Germans there, and they lived under the threat of Germany for hundreds of years. It is a different kind of thing, and I still have this feeling, though Graham Allison will disagree profoundly, I still have this feeling that there's a missed boat here, that there's not enough attention being devoted to what Russians were thinking at the time. And we're thinking of it only through an American lens, and that isn't sharp enough, in my opinion.
But Marvin, wasn't the commander of that nuclear sub ready to fire a nuclear missile, a nuclear torpedo at one of our destroyers? And
Shattuck and I were told that 2 weeks ago in Havana.
It wasn't, I mean, that gets, whatever the Russians thought, the Russian people thought, that gets awfully close to a nuclear war.
Yes, it does.
And
yes,
you think Berlin was not on Kennedy's mind? You remember we were ushered out to the Rose Garden around noontime on Sunday when he accepts the conciliatory Khrushchev cable instead of the bellicose. I'm walking through, I'm the last one, I see a yellow pad. I have Kennedy's notes from the first debate, of which I was a panelist. They're in the Freedom Forum Museum now. I want that. You know what was written on it? 5 times and encircled? Berlin. I reached for it, Ted Clifton, the military, said, this one's for the archives. Berlin was on his mind. Maybe on the minds of the Russians.
It had to have been. I'm not sure who was first. Were you there first? Alex, you're younger. You go ahead.
Yes, I am, indeed. I'm young enough to remember this very well, and I also include myself in the 4%. I was in Tennessee, 60 miles from Oak Ridge. We figured that the Russian missiles were probably not very accurate, and we were going to be among the first to go out. But this actually brings a serious question that I'd like the panel, perhaps, Tom, you're the one to really respond to this. I don't know it, but I'd like to hear anyone's thought. I was struck by what Marvin said about the difference in the public opinion here and public opinion as it is expressed, and the things that, like Bob Pierpoint has talked about how people in California simply did not get the idea that there was actually something to be afraid of. I remember very well, I was a teenager, I thought this was it. I thought this was the end. And I got that feeling entirely from watching television. My question is this. Do the media have the power to persuade people that there is genuine danger when there is not? They seem to be able to do that sometimes, and yet at a time when there is genuine danger, where at least a lot of the people who were close to it in Washington thought there was huge danger, that is not communicated. Why, at a moment like we're in right now, are the people who seem to be closest to it, the people in the military, the people in intelligence, for better or worse, the people in Cambridge, Massachusetts, why are they so concerned? And yet what is being communicated, or at least what is being received, is something quite different, and the people out there are not. And I would go to what has just been talked about Soviet intentions may simply have been about Berlin, but in fact, if we'd fired after that U-2 was shot down, if something else had happened, it was very easy to imagine a scenario that would have gotten us into a shooting war, whether one was intended or not. And that sense of unintended consequences and something spinning out of control is what I suspect frightens an awful lot of people today, even more than that sort of brinksmanship then. But my question essentially is, does the media have the power to do anything about public opinion in this way, really? Or is it something that is inbred in the American mind, that is in denial, especially when the president is saying something that goes counter to what maybe other people think?
Okay. Tom, why don't you start us?
Okay, let me say one thing. The media does two things. First of all, it reports events. It broadcasts President Kennedy's speech to the nation. And then it also then adds its interpretation and puts different facts together. But in terms of, I think one has to remember is how powerful was what Kennedy said directly to the people. Let me quote a little bit of that. He warned that it was, quote, a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set. No one can foresee precisely what course it will take, what cost or casualties will be incurred. And later in this same broadcast, he talked about worldwide nuclear war in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. And then the needing to move the world back from the abyss of destruction. This is what the president was saying directly to us. And the American people got the message that this was a crisis of great importance. What they didn't do is fall apart because of it.
Did they ever fall apart?
The American people in times of crisis, and this being one example, 9/11 being another example, show a great resiliency. Where they fall apart, in a sense, in a different sense of the term, is what happened with Vietnam, when you had years and years of failure to succeed and years of saying, well, we're going to win it next month, it's going to be over, and it kept coming out differently than what they were told. They fell apart in the sense that they stopped backing the government. And it wasn't just the protesters in the street. It was middle America that said, no, this isn't going, this is a failure. We haven't been getting the correct information on this. And in that sense, in a slow process, but not a sudden process, fell apart in the sense that they stopped backing the government.
They stopped backing the government when the sons of the white middle class started to get drafted. Mayor Daley was against the war in Vietnam because who was being drafted from Chicago? Poor whites and poor blacks. And
being drafted and dying.
Dying, yeah. Sons of the white middle class, that's when it fell apart.
It seems to me
Alex was asking whether the press has the power. Right?
Television has the power, yeah.
Television has that.
I think, in a way, Tom has given a pretty good answer to that. In the short run, it seems to me that the American public can be bamboozled. It can be propagandized. It can be misled. But in the long run, with all of the avenues of communication that we have today, I think in the long run, the American public begins to understand and begins to care and begins to exert pressure in the direction that the popular, in the beginning, the popular will is one thing, but on second thought, it begins to change. So I think television in the long run doesn't have the influence that it has in initial impact.
We've got about, I'm sorry, Newt, I just wanted to mention that we've got about 5 minutes to go, so if you want to add a brief comment, fine.
Well, a very good study could be done of the reaction of the public to the sniper coverage as to whether the media can frighten the hell out of people or whether the sanity and it's a very good question.
Well, as a neo-Washingtonian, I can say you don't get frightened, but you certainly become aware of a danger that's all around. It's so arbitrary.
There's an expression there, Marvin, in Washington during that period that your barber would cut your hair for you for $15, and for another $25, he'll fill your tank in your car.
Go ahead, please.
My question is about the sentiment of the United States after the missile crisis ended. What did the public feel, and did any anti-Cuban sentiment impact the Kennedy and Johnson administration's embargo that came a few years later?
Well, the two things. First of all, after it was all over, the public was very optimistic in terms of expectation of war with the Russians went way down, And 1962, survey done at the end of the year, so after the crisis, was the only year in 20-year period, 10 years before and after that, in which more Americans thought American power was on the rise than thought Soviet power was on the rise. So in the aftermath, we saw this as a big win for America and something that actually left the Cold War less hot in the aftermath. In terms of Cuba, we've now lived with Fidel Castro for over 40 years, and he's part of the world. But there was a lot stronger anti-Castro sentiment and a lot more belief. And Kennedy was on the defensive in the congressional campaign that he hadn't done enough to deal with the problem of the Russians in Cuba and Castro in particular. In the aftermath, I think this, I don't think this changed one way or the other. There was still this idea that Cuba was a threat, but it quickly fell on the back burner, and it really never became a major issue since.
Except in Florida.
No.
Except in Florida.
Because the Cubans were in Florida, yes.
Sir, you have the bright privilege and honor of asking the last question.
Is there the tiniest possibility that the wily old fox in Moscow wanted to get rid of the missiles in Turkey and sent, I don't know, did anybody ever see the actual warheads in Cuba?
The actual warheads in Cuba?
Yeah.
It has been said that they were there by the people who were supposed to have seen them. That's my understanding of it.
The Soviets said they were there.
We saw the missiles on television.
And they were, my understanding is that it was not only the missiles that were there, but when the missiles are in a certain position, that indicates that they're ready to be fired. Now, whether they're ready to be fired with a nose cone filled with nuclear material, I personally do not know. But I do know that people who claim to know said that the nuclear-tipped missiles were ready to be launched, yes. I mean, that's my understanding. Is that correct?
I think that's right.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Just wondering if Khrushchev took advantage of a new president who hadn't been in office very long and persuaded him that here were missiles that could, something to swap for the missiles in Turkey.
After Vienna, conventional wisdom is that Khrushchev thought he could push this guy around. And on the trip back to London that night, and I was not a pool reporter, I can't remember, was it Bill Lawrence or
Mr. Lawrence?
Lawrence came up, the New York Times, and I think he was with ABC then. They quit the New York Times. He said that Kennedy was as pessimistic as he ever had seen him about the question of war and peace. And Khrushchev battered him around. Kennedy came from a pretty rough school of politics. He didn't survive Stalin.
So there's a very interesting story that when there were two meetings between the two leaders in Vienna, and one was in the Russian embassy and the other was in the American embassy, and Kennedy was the host in the American embassy, of course. And when Khrushchev walked in, Kennedy stood up to receive him. Perfectly normal, obvious thing to do. After the meeting was over, Khrushchev told a number of his people, including Sukhadrev, the interpreter, from whom I got the information, that he said, "Did you notice an American president stood up as Nikita Khrushchev walked into the room?" That's the kind of power Nikita Khrushchev had. American president stood up. Now, that comes from the mind of a very sharp, shrewd person, but nevertheless a peasant by birth and upbringing in a way, and the communist school of politics was not an easy school. And he thought, what kind of clout I've got, because an American president stands up in my presence. That was Scotty Reston had an interview with the president immediately after that meeting was over. And Reston, it came out in the New York Times that the Kennedy quote that he told Khrushchev, in that case he said it's going to be a cold winter, or a hot summer, something like that. A long winter. And then he immediately added troops to Berlin, because Berlin was very, very much in his mind. If you guys would like to have a 30-second rap, you can do that now, or else I'll give it a 30-second rap for all of this. No.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. In that case, I thank you all. This has been the fifth and the final one that we're going to do on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but do come back. There will be many others. Thanks very much for being with us.